Hello again. This is our second session in our Stories of the Old Testament. In our first session, we examined the life of Abraham. In this session, we will look at two more of the patriarchs, Isaac and Jacob, and we'll start with a quick review of Abraham and his family. We'll take a look at the family tree here. We have the family of Abram and Sarai, husband and wife, who are half-brothers, and the half-brothers, perhaps, maybe full brothers of Abram, Nahor and Haran, as well as the son of Haran named Lot. When Abram, who traveled to the land of Canaan with Sarai and Lot, when Abram had no offspring and Sarai was unable to conceive, she presented a concubine to Abram named Hagar, and with Hagar, Abram was able to father a son named Ishmael. 13 years later, Sarai was able to finally conceive, and she presented Abram with a son named Isaac. And this has become a standard of religious art, as I mentioned in our last session. I'll show you this picture again. This is Abraham, who is about to sacrifice his son Isaac. His hand is being stayed by an angel, and you can see the ram in the thicket that was to replace the sacrifice. The Bible gives us no more details about the life of Isaac until he's about 40 years old. We get the sense that he was staying around the tents and with his father and doing whatever jobs you do as a wandering Bedouin for 40 years, and his parents felt that it was time for him to marry. And the decision was made to send a servant of his named Eleazar back to the old country to select a daughter and bring her back as a wife for Isaac. If you look at the map, you can see that they were centered. Gilead is a region that is on the eastern side of the Great Rift, and Isaac and his family were centered in the region of Beersheba, and the servant Eleazar had to go from Beersheba up to Paddan Aram, which is a few hundred miles, which would be a sizable trip in those days, on foot typically, perhaps moving 10 to 15 miles a day. When he arrived in Paddan Aram, he was given instructions by the Lord as to how he would recognized the woman who had been selected as the potential wife for Isaac. Her name happened to be Rebecca, and she was the granddaughter of one of Abraham's brothers. Eleazar was given instructions on how he would recognize this intended bride. She would be a girl coming from the well, and she would offer him water and offer to water his camels as well. This also became a common subject for religious art, and I wanted to show you one picture that is particularly amusing on this subject. It's a Poussin that was done in 1648, and it's entitled "The Meeting of Eleazar and Rebecca at the Well." You can see Eleazar and Rebecca in the center of the picture, but what's particularly amusing is the group of girls off to one side who are observing the activities with great interest. Obviously, a stranger coming up and offering gifts and jewelry to a young woman is an object of great curiosity, but this other group off to the right here are particularly amusing. You can see the expressions on their face. You can almost read what they're thinking. Why is Rebecca getting all that attention and we aren't? But this is typical of the religious art of the time. Now, the Bible tells us that Rebecca was very beautiful. She was a virgin. No man had ever lain with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again, which was the sign that she was the one that was selected by the Lord as the potential bride for Isaac. This is perhaps a more realistic image of what she might have looked like at the time, with much of her wealth around her neck in the form of jewelry and various piercings and bracelets and so forth, and carrying the water. They would have carried the water on their heads or on their shoulders. But she was the selected wife of Isaac, and she returned with him, with Eleazar. Unfortunately, Isaac and Rebekah had no children for 20 years. This would mean that Isaac was perhaps 60 years old at the time that his twins, Jacob and Esau, were born. How old was Rebekah? It's a speculation, but if she was young and unmarried and the daughter of a prominent businessman in the area where she lived, she would have been highly desirable as a bride and would have been married very quickly. In those days, girls were married at the time that they became physical women, able to bear children, and so at 14 or 15, if she was unmarried, she was probably 14 or 15 years old, which means she was in her 30s with her first children, Jacob and Esau. We'll take another look at the family tree here. We have a son of Nahor, Bethuel, who would have been the father of two children, Rebekah and Laban, that we know about. And it was decided that Rebekah would marry Isaac, and between the two of them, they fathered the children Jacob and Esau. And it's important to recognize that Jacob would eventually be given a second name. He would be called Israel. Anytime you read the name Israel in the book of Genesis, it is referring to a man by the name of Jacob, rather than the nationality or the cultural group. The Bible now leaves Isaac. We don't hear much about him anymore, and it focuses on the life of Jacob for a while. Eventually it will return, and we'll pick up on the end of the life of Isaac. But I want to take a moment to discuss matters of law and rules of behavior that were given to Abraham. From Abraham to the Exodus was a period of hundreds of years, depending on how you interpret the numbers in the Bible. And there had to have been a code of conduct of some sort that was required by the Lord as a sort of a quid quo pro in return for giving a nation to Abraham. And there had to be something other than circumcision that would govern their behavior. The fact that they were able to remain as an identifiable group of people with a select code of behavior all the way through the enslavement in Egypt would suggest that they had to have some code of conduct, and the Bible doesn't tell us what this was. However, it's unavoidable that we can conclude that there was such a set of rules given, because if you look at this passage in Genesis, it says that the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, this was after Abraham had died, the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, I will be with you and bless you, because Abraham obeyed me. He kept my requirements, my commands, my decrees, and my laws. Now, what this suggests is that Abraham was given a very specific set of rules of behavior for worship and for our cultural conduct. And so if that is the case, then it might suggest that the giving of the law in Mount Sinai was actually a second giving and not a first giving. It was a reiteration of what the Lord expected his people to do. Let's go back to the life of Jacob. This is the famous story where he betrayed his brother, he deceived his father with the help of his mother. This was quite a betrayal of her husband as well. But Jacob wanted to receive the blessing and the inheritance. This was done with a laying on of hands, basically, and it was irrevocable. Once someone received the blessing, which was pretty much an indication of divine favor, it's not something that could be appealed in a court. You can't undo the will. And once Jacob had betrayed his brother, Esau responded by stating that he was going to kill Jacob on the day that their father Isaac died. He didn't want to kill Jacob while Isaac was still alive, so he would wait until Jacob died, until Isaac died, and then Jacob would be dealt with by Esau. Rebekah didn't want to have to deal with the death of her favorite son and her husband on the same day, so she advised Jacob to flee, and he went back to Paddan Aram and the home of Rebekah's family. He was impoverished when he did so. He took no money with him, and he fled, so he arrived in a state of impoverishment. We can look at their route here. It was the same route that was taken by Eleazar, traveling from Beersheba up to Paddan Aram. The events that take place up in Paddan Aram are a little bit confusing. If one works out the dates and the ages of the various players in this story, Jacob was in his 70s. I know this goes contrary to the favored view of the young lovers, Jacob and Rachel, but in point of fact, if you work out the details, working back from the time of Joseph and the Pharaoh and Jacob and their arrival in Egypt, we find out that Jacob was perhaps in his 90s when he fathered Joseph. He was in his 70s when he arrived. Leah and Rachel, the two daughters that he was interested in or would eventually be married to, were probably again in their teens. They were unmarried and the daughters of a man of position and wealth, and so were desirable as marriage partners. But he had no money, so he had to work for 7 years, presumably to earn the bride price. The marriage took place. He worked for 7 years, anticipating that he would marry Rachel, who was the younger sister and unmarried. And when he awoke on his wedding morning, the morning after the wedding, he found out that he had indeed been married to Leah rather than Rachel. Laban, his uncle at that point, who had cheated him, agreed that he could also marry Rachel, but he had to work for another 7 years, presumably to earn the bride price once again. During those 7 years, we have what might be referred to as the Battle of the Babies, in which both Leah and Rachel and two concubines bear children to Jacob, creating the large family tree that we're going to look at right now. Israel, or Jacob, who would become Israel, wanted to marry Rachel, but he was married to Leah, and again in a ruse that was created by Laban, because Leah was the older of the two sisters. So he was married to Leah, and then a week later was also took Rachel as a wife. Leah immediately began bearing children: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and at that point she stopped having children, but Rachel, who was barren at that point, provided a concubine, as we talked about in our last session, kind of a second-tier wife whose children would also be legitimate heirs. But Bilhah was able to bear two children, Dan and Naphtali. And at that point, Leah, who apparently had passed a year or so without bearing a child, was then able to bear some more children. But she also gave a concubine, Leah did, to Israel, to Jacob. And Zilpah was able to bear two sons as well, Gad and Asher. Leah gave birth to Issachar and Zebulun, and we're also told that she bore a daughter named Dinah. At that point, finally, Rachel, who was humiliated after all of these years of being barren and not having a child, finally was able to give birth to a son named Joseph. Now, she was well into her 20s at this point. If she had been first seen by Jacob when she was in her young teens, and then was married 7 years later, and then didn't bear her first child for another 5 or 6 years, she would be closing in on 30 years of age at that point. And she didn't bear her second son, whose name was Benjamin, for another 15 or 16 years. So she would have been well into her 40s at the time of her second child. Now, we are also told that Joseph, down in Egypt, fathered two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. And all of the names that you see in the orange colors here are the names of the primary tribes of Israel. Now, actually, Manasseh and Ephraim are referred to as the house of Joseph. The tribe of Levi did not get a regional territory because they became the priesthood and were scattered throughout all of the other territories. Now, just to bring this family tree to a close, there's one other point that we need to take a look at. According to Muslim tradition, Ishmael is the ancestor of Muhammad ibn Abdullah, who is the Muhammad who who founded the faith of Islam. And it is through that particular group, Hagar, Ishmael, and Abram, that the Islamic faith has determined its lineage back to Abram. It should be pointed out that that particular link is not listed in the Quran, but it is a traditional position of the Islamic faith that Ishmael is related to Abram back through the various generations. After Jacob had fathered all of these children, he continued to work for another 6 years with Laban. He was acquiring some wealth. And then he slipped away with his wife, his wives, his children, and his various flocks without telling Laban. And we're told that he traveled to the land of Gilead. He went from Paddan Aram down to Gilead, and Laban came after him in hot pursuit once he discovered that his son-in-law was gone. They had their confrontation or their meeting at Gilead, and then Laban returned back to Paddan Aram, presumably never again to meet with Jacob or his daughters. At this point, if we look at the region a little bit more closely, we can see the corner of Gilead as it comes down to the Great Rift and the junction of the Jordan River and the Jabbok River, where we are told that Jacob had a confrontation or a meeting with a divine creature. Some would argue that that was the Lord. Some would argue that it was a heavenly being of some sort, but they wrestled throughout the night, and it was there that Jacob, we are told, was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but will be Israel." Israel, meaning he who has wrestled with or he who has contested with God. And he was given that name because you have wrestled with God and with men and have overcome. If you've ever taken a trip to Israel, this is the picture of the Jabbok River where the buses can stop. Actually, the confluence of the Jabbok River down by the Jordan is much lower and bigger, but this is a place where you can at least see the river passing through the land. At this point, Jacob was reunited with his brother Esau. He was greatly in fear of this reuniting because he was afraid that Esau still bore him a grudge. But they were able to meet peaceably, and they parted company not to see each other again until the death of their father. Now, Jacob traveled to Shechem. He crossed the river and traveled up into the Judean hills to the city of Shechem, lived there, bought some land, and he stayed there for some time. We have to assume that he'd been there for a while because land wasn't sold to strangers. He would have had to establish some relationships, and he stayed there long enough for the young girl Dinah, who was about 6 when they left Paddan Aram, to have become old enough to be regarded as desirable as a marriage partner. We can see that they traveled from Peniel, which was where Jacob met the heavenly being and wrestled with him, and traveled across the Great Rift up into Shechem. In Shechem, I mentioned that they had had this incident where Dinah was walking through a field and was raped by the son of the king of Shechem. The boy's name was also Shechem at that time. So we have to assume that Dinah was in her teens at that time. She was old enough to be of marriageable age, and a marriage was arranged, but the brothers of Dinah were very unhappy with the way their sister had been treated, and a few days after the circumcision of the men of Shechem, they went through the town and slaughtered many of them as they lay in their beds. If we look at the slide here, we can see that they were up in Shechem, and they performed their slaughter on the men of Shechem, and then in a hurry, Jacob and his family had to travel south. They were traveling south at that point towards Bethlehem, and we are told that it was there at that point that Rachel gave birth to Benjamin. Now, once again, if we calculate the passage of time, we find that there had been perhaps 6 years of living in Paddan Aram after Joseph had been born, and then they traveled to Shechem, and they lived there long enough for Dinah, who was a little girl, to have grown up into marriageable age. And then they were traveling to Bethlehem, and we can place the age of Rachel perhaps into her 40s. Now, this would be only her second child, and she was in her 40s. She was on the road in a time of very poor hygiene. It was very common for women to die in childbirth, and infant mortality was very high. And so it's not unreasonable to conclude that this story is accurate, that Rachel had conceived late in life, and then she delivered this small child, Benjamin, and then died. There is a picture here of the tomb of Rachel. It's on the road to Bethlehem, and that tomb has been there to commemorate her death at that point. Now, from Bethlehem, they continued on south, arriving in the area of Hebron, which is where Jacob lived out the rest of his life. At this point, Jacob seems to have settled down. He had his 12 sons. He had 11 sons who were half-brothers, by and large, most of them. There were 6 different mothers, and so you have an assortment of brothers and half-brothers. You have Joseph, whose mother has died, and he was in his middle teens at that point and had a younger brother by Benjamin, who was either a toddler or a baby at that point. And after the loss of Joseph's mother, apparently Joseph became one of the favorites of the patriarch of the group, who was Jacob. He now goes by the name of Israel, and we're going to pick up his story and Joseph's story and his sail into Egypt in our next session. I did want to make a couple of comments about that wonderful story of the wedding of Leah and Jacob. There are those who would suggest that it's a bit fanciful to think that a man could get married and not know who his bride was. But if you look at the wedding customs of the people of that day, the way the weddings would play out is that there would be days of celebration, perhaps primarily with the men separated from the women. There would be a fair amount of drinking and activities going on there. And then the bride would be brought in for the ceremony, and she would be veiled and covered up in a robe. She might even be completely covered, and in some cultures she would be brought in on a platform where she would actually be raised and covered, and then she would be presented to the groom. And after the wedding ceremony took place, they would pass into a private room where the wedding would be consummated. And at that point, there would have to be proof of virginity and consummation that would occur, and the bedclothes would be brought out and in many cases retained by the bride's family to prove that she was indeed presented as a virginal bride in those circumstances. Now, if Jacob had done quite a bit of drinking, she would have been brought in, and they would have been placed into a dark room, and it's very possible that events could have unfolded without his recognizing who she was until the next morning. And at that point, he would realize that he had married the wrong sister. He would confront Laban, his uncle, who would apologize for the confusion and promise a second wife to him next week after the week of the honeymoon, which makes you feel a certain amount of sadness for Leah, because she remarked on many occasions that she was unloved, and that Rachel was the true love of her husband Jacob. We'll pick up the story of Joseph and his sail into Egypt in our next session. Hope to see you then.
Bible Interact is a group of Bible scholars and biblical archaeologists who promote the Hebraic nature of Scripture and view the two Testaments as one unified message. They explain how they use a first-century approach to searching the Scriptures, and they share their methods and discoveries for discussion and dialogue. They invite your comments and participation on BibleInteract.tv, where you can also find more teachings, self-study quizzes, webinars, and interviews.